Hello, my name is Alec Feather, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program, presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you about today's program. Please let us know your feedback by contacting us on social media or via email at thedoleinstitute@ku.edu. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. A video of today's presentation will be available on our website soon. We would like to encourage each of you to consider becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Our friends help keep our programs free and open and support archive research and our student activities. Please contact us if you're interested. After the presentation, we'll have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with the microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. If you are interested in attending more summer programs at the Dole Institute, please refer to the back of today's program handout with a listing of our June programs. A full listing of the summer schedule is available at www.doleinstitute.org. Before we begin, I would like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sean Kalic and Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Johnson.
Thank you. You guys get to be guinea pigs today because we're trying something new where we have two speakers, not just one. So we figured what we would do is talk about two primary theorists that we spend a lot of time discussing and arguing about at CGSC, and they are Antoine Jomini, this guy, and then Carl von Clausewitz over there. So I'll handle the Jomini stuff. Colonel Johnson will handle the Clausewitz stuff. But we'll do an intro and then we'll kind of open up for discussion as we move along and at the end. The significance of these two theorists is they both come out of the same time period. So they both use Frederick the Great as a historical touchstone. They also both fight during Napoleonic Wars. Jomini is going to fight on the French side, and Clausewitz is going to fight on the Prussian side, and ultimately they're going to end up both on the Russian sides briefly too, by the way. And then Jomini is going to go hang out with the Russians till his death, essentially. Clausewitz will go back to the Prussians and then hang around till about 1830 before he prematurely passes away. So what's unique about these two characters is that they have a very different kind of perspective on what they saw during this experience. So we tend to use them as foils at CGSC. So we tend to kind of pitch it as Jomini's really, war is relatively easy. It's a cookie cutter approach, and it's a recipe for how you win war. Objective offense, mass maneuver. It's pretty simple. But yet, on the other side, you have Clausewitz, who argues that it's a much more complex dynamic thing because you have human beings there with emotion and passion, and it's not as simple as this guy tends to make the point. So we tend to use them as almost foils in the classroom that this guy says war is easy, this guy says war is really hard, and then you're gonna have to figure out on your own major what you wanna do with it. So we figured what we would do today is kind of talk about where we actually see similarities, because there's a few of us that may be heretics who argue that they actually fit together pretty well at the application side. So we'll kind of look at the philosophical side of their ideas, the nature of war, how they both see the physical nature of war, what it is, what they saw, and then we'll look at the idea of what their ideal commander looks like, or what they call military genius. And they both have some slight differences on what they see as genius as far as a commander goes. And then the last point we'll look at is uncertainty in war. So this idea about friction and fog, which I heard a few folks talking about at the end. So we'll look about how they both see it, because it's traditionally taught that Jomini doesn't care anything about that stuff, but the reality is he does, and he mentions it. So we'll talk about how he addresses it as compared to Clausewitz. Any questions yet on kind of how we're going to go about this? Because we debated whether to make this, interactive and engaging, where we're going to get into a fight at the end, but the reality is we'll keep it somewhat civil, I think, right? Let me give some background on essentially Jomini, and then we'll turn it over to Colonel Johnson to do the next part. Here's the Army's take as of 1945, and it really hasn't changed much since then, by the way. So there is a long history of these folks being significant theorists within the context of the U.S. Army. I would argue that both of them have a heavy, heavy influence not only on the doctrine of the U.S. Army. Jomini's main name may not appear in doctrine, but the idea that they emphasize offense, mass, and maneuver is there, which are Jominian principles. Clausewitz's name is, of course, interjected throughout. So they both have a profound impact on not just doctrine, but also the application of how our majors see and use the doctrine as well. So keep that in mind as we go through, that the last sentence is really probably the most significant. These differences may be more apparent than real. So we'll talk about the reality of how they fit together and not necessarily are diametrically opposed. Okay, Antoine Jomini. A bit different from the Clausewitz. In fact, he's Swiss, comes from a banking and commercial family, has some early experience in the Swiss militia, but this is during essentially the French Revolution and then the early Napoleonic Wars, or the Wars of the Revolution. And he wants to see much more action because the Swiss, what are the Swiss known for? Besides cheese, chocolate, and cowbell? Neutrality, right. So if you're an up-and-coming officer, do you really want to just hang out in Swiss, or do you want to go over the border and go to France and get into the real action? So he wants to make a name for himself. So as he sees what's going on, he's a pretty significant student of history, so he's looking at the campaigns of Frederick the Great. So in 1805, he publishes his first major work, Treaty on Grand Military Operations, where he outlines how Frederick was able to be such a strong military commander, despite the fact that he often fought outnumbered. And this is where he starts to kind of develop his ideas about what he thinks about war and what these theories are, and I'll talk about that during the nature of war. So based upon this book, which is going to get slipped to Napoleon, and what's unique is the fact that Jomini's going to write his own kind of biography throughout points of his life. So he's going to make a comment that this somehow ended up in Napoleon's hands. Napoleon was so obsessed with, oh, this is a great book. Who wrote this on? It's on my staff. We're not sure that's really true or just coming from Jomini, who was a shameless self-promoter, by the way. He is accepted on Jomini's staff, by the way, because, on Napoleon's staff, because the book does make an impact on Napoleon and Napoleon's staff. So Marshal Ney is going to accept him as a staff officer. He's essentially brought onto the staff of Ney as a colonel, which is a pretty good gig, I guess, to start right as an 06 versus a young private or something like that. And it's really based upon his ideas about how he sees war and how he can analyze war. What's going to be unique for Jomini is that throughout his tenure, he really is going to maintain a staff-level officer's perspective. He's not going to command on the battlefield. He's not going to fight on the battlefield. He's going to stand back and plan with the marshals and the staff in the rear. He's going to make a pretty good name for himself, as you can see throughout 1806 through 1812. He takes part in the Russian campaign, but again, in a planning perspective, not in a fighting perspective. The problem that Jomini runs into is, as I mentioned, he's a shameless self-promoter. And Napoleon's major staff officer is Berthier. And he's not real fond of this young Swiss officer who kind of makes a name for himself but doesn't have a lot to back it up. So he's constantly suspicious of Jomini. Jomini is in the running for a promotion to brigadier general. Berthier isn't real fond of it. After the campaign of 1812, he's going to bring Jomini up on charges for not submitting the proper paperwork and reports and wants to have him jailed. Pretty significant for not doing the paperwork, but it's the French army at the time, right? He's going to end up resigning from the army because, again, he has a sense that he really has found something unique within history, that he's analyzed the great campaigns throughout time and has synthesized the elements of what war is. So you can't be stopped if you're Jomini, right? Because, again, shameless self-promoter, and if you believe you found the very principles of war, you have to go on with projecting those ideas. So he's going to join the Russian army. The Russian army is going to essentially offer him a commission, and from the remainder of his life, he's going to kind of come and go out of Russia from 1816 on, actually until his death in 1869. And he's going to write good, solid doctrine for them, but also help set up their Russian military academy, and at times advise as well on various elements of what the Russians are doing throughout Crimea and other wars within the empire. And ultimately he dies in 1869, which is pretty significant because in 1870 you have the Franco-Prussian War, which is in many ways the kind of tail end of the Napoleonic era. So despite the fact that he has lived such a long span, his ideas are going to have a significant impact on the way the First World War is fought, and I would argue ultimately the Second World War as well. So we'll see the longevity of his ideas. Turn it over to...
We'll do WWF and we'll tag out here as we go by. Well, first off, I appreciate everybody coming out on a rainy afternoon. What a good deal to get to think about history, and specifically Jomini and Karl von Clausewitz. I wanted to share with you first because we instruct majors at the Commanding General Staff College, and so this is sort of their view of what Clausewitz is as we study it. So Clausewitz and Hell. This actually comes from, there's a website called Clausewitz.com. So if you get really excited about Clausewitz and you want to go do more research, just let it wash over you, embrace it, and go to www.clausewitz.com and go for it. So our students also lovingly refer to Karl von Clausewitz as Dead Karl. And they know him as Dead Karl because a lot of senior leaders show up and they want to put a quotation from Dead Karl on their slides. It gives a sense of gravitas and some seriousness. Here's a more common portrait of Karl von Clausewitz. And so his background is interesting to contrast with Jomini. First off, he's born in 1780, which is as the empire of Frederick the Great is waning, that's going to be where Clausewitz is actually cutting his teeth. And I don't know what you guys were doing when you were 12 years old, but Clausewitz was signing into his first regiment at the age of 12. And by 13, he was in combat. And which, again, that's kind of stark. And I point that out because a lot of times folks don't attribute Clausewitz to seeing sort of the face of battle. And the face of battle is something that Clausewitz is familiar with. He is a staff officer, but he's going to be at over 30 campaigns and encounters along the way. So he joins his regiment, he goes right to combat, and then basically he's going to get to go to the schoolhouse where he's going to start to hone his intellect, and he has an aptitude for it. You know, he might have even been what we would call a spring butt. I'm not sure about that. That's my own conjecture. But he's taken under the tutelage of a guy named Scharnhorst, who brings him into the fold and starts to reward and encourage Clausewitz's intellect. After he graduates from school, he becomes the tutor and the adjutant to Prince August of Prussia, where he's going to go to war. And unfortunately, at Auerstadt, he's going to be captured. He's taken prisoner of war, so he has that experience. And courtesy of the French, he gets to spend 1 year in captivity, where he gets to hone a righteous hatred of all things French. And that is going to color his worldview as later on, when he goes back and tries to help reform Prussia, and Prussia decides to align with Napoleon and go to Russia. And actually, a great deal for Clausewitz, he's able to leave the Prussian army and go serve in Russia in protest against the French and his own state of Prussia, which just goes to show you, we don't have that mobility in the United States Army, I'll have you know. So, you know, we go to Leavenworth and we stay there. We don't go to Canada or any place like that, so we don't have that option for us. But he becomes a reformer, and with Scharnhorst and later another leader named Gneisenau, and they are going to be a large part of trying to create a Prussian army that is going to be responsive and try to lift Prussia out of really being subjugated by revolutionary France and Napoleonic France. He's at a lot of battles that you would know about. He's at the Battle of Borodino during the Russian campaign. He takes place in the Battle of Waterloo. So he is well accustomed to studying one of his two marks, one being Napoleon and the other being Frederick the Great. And then he's going to be the head of their war academy. And unfortunately, he's going to leave us early. Whereas you got to hear that Jomini is going to be on the disco plan. He gets the long-term writing option. Unfortunately, due to cholera, Clausewitz's scholarship and his writing is going to be curtailed. He's going to die at the age of 51, and his wife, Marie, is going to posthumously publish on war, which is really what we know him for. So I want to sort of shift our discussion here, and we'll start talking about war's nature. And so as Dr. Kalic said, we're going to sort of look at how both of these theorists look at war, and then we'll move into military genius, and we'll finally look at how they are with uncertainty and chance. But one of the things that we study a great deal at the Command and General Staff College as far as Clausewitz goes is how he deals with the nature of war. And many theorists deal with the physical aspects of war, but Clausewitz spends a lot of time and a lot of effort and really frames this idea of the moral component. And he groups a lot of different things into the moral component, everything from genius and chance and uncertainty. There's a lot of things that make the moral component arguably one of the strong suits for what Clausewitz talks about. And here I would just mention to you that there are really three actions that he says that can happen in war. The first one is the plain use of force. And then from there, you can also try to impose your will on your opponent. And then finally, there's also disarming. And those aren't necessarily sequential, but as he was studying it, that's how he sort of framed his discussion. But I want to just pause for a second and give you a sense of Prussia. Now, if you're like me, I'm originally from Mississippi, so I heard about Prussia, and I wasn't sure where Prussia was. I certainly didn't know what they spoke there, but this is Prussia, just to sort of orient you. We've got Russia over here. We're going to have the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We've got France over here, Denmark, Sweden. And so Prussia is actually a pretty small state. In 1807, the blue here represents Prussia. And so this is the time of Clausewitz, but they are surrounded by potential adversaries. And because they're small, it's not a resource intense location, population-wise, very limited economic means, and arguably they are an army with a country. And so it tends to focus them very much on the aspects of war. And so as a result, that is going to be a focus that he takes up for his beloved Prussia. I also I couldn't come to KU without doing some art appreciation, so I hope you'll bear with me here. But the time frame, one of the big influences on Clausewitz is the German Romantic period. And the Romantic period is one of the things it's in response to, partially, is the French Revolution that brings the wave that sort of brings Napoleon to rise. And Clausewitz is studying Napoleon. And so in some ways, he's a reaction to Napoleon. But this idea, one of the ideas that I wanted to stress with the Romantic period in Germany is this idea of uncertainty. And there was a lot of struggling intellectually with how we know the things that we know and what can we really perceive, and that maybe the Enlightenment, where everything was ordered, structured, and you could calculate it, maybe the world really wasn't like that. And if not, maybe it was foggy, misty, difficult to make out. In some ways you can see for infinite and have an infinite horizon. In other ways, it's obscure. And this is part of the intellectual background that Clausewitz brought to his interpretation as he tried to understand war. And so very much influenced by German Romanticism. And so I want to keep that in mind because later on as we go through some of his principles, and I'm sure you've heard of like the fog of war, it sort of fits with that idea. Yes, sir?
What about the Teutonic Knights and their experiences in moving east? Did that have any, in his education, any influence on him?
Yeah, what I would say is that Clausewitz is a student of war, and he's a student of Prussian war. So he is, and part of his time when he's at the War Academy, and then later on as he heads it up, it's very much focused on trying to understand all aspects of war. For my talk today, we'll focus pretty much on the fact that he looked at Frederick the Great, and he also looks at Napoleon. But he is, I guess the message I would give for all of us is that he is a student of his times, intellectually, militarily, and that's part of his dynamic. It's also partly why probably my students believe that they're in hell when they're studying Clausewitz, because he tends to be very dense to read, but he's a very studious scholar of the art of war in general. So as we move through, just keep this in mind, and if you would, keep this image in mind. This is by Carl David Friedrich. It's called The Wanderer Above the Sea of Mist. And it's famous because it represents German Romanticism, that idea of an individual just looking out and trying to perceive and having, and recognizing that there's this swirling chaos and it's not all clear cut, but the potential is infinite. So you hear about war is just a wrestling match. Or is war a duel? Or perhaps you've seen this quotation. I'd be remiss, probably get fired right now if I didn't at least show you this quotation, but you've probably heard various leaders at some point in time saying that war is merely the continuation of politics, and he goes by other means. I throw this all out because one of the dangers, going back again to my students, when people quote Clausewitz, they like to put the quotation, cherry pick it, and find the one that basically validates whatever their point is. But if we go back, is war just a duel? Yes. Is war a wrestling match? Yes. Is war a card game? Yes. Is it a struggle of politics and will? Yes, it's all of these. So how can that be? And that's a big takeaway. This picture is actually from 1990, and I put it up here because it sort of captured the idea. We've got Colin Powell and getting ready with Kuwait and Iraq, and that relationship. And we need to keep in mind that politics cannot be separated from war. War cannot be separated from politics. And just to sort of explain how he gets to this idea, because he's a theoretical sort of guy, he goes out and he believes at the time there's this idea in Romanticism that you can have opposites and there's tensions between different ideas. So you have ideal war, and if war was left to itself, it becomes extreme. It would go to its extreme, and maximum force would be used until one side won, or they were both destroyed in the process. But it's also a logical fantasy. It's an exercise, because Clausewitz realizes that in actuality, it can't be absolute. And we might think, well, what are some of the things that would stop it from being absolute? And so I don't want to go too much into spoiling later on, but it's terms that you've heard before, like friction, and like things like fear and fatigue, parts of war that keep it from going from its extreme. And so in reality, we come up with something short of this ideal. So this ideal part is just if war was totally unchecked. Fortunately for all of us, war is usually checked. The result of this is another idea that he's gotten. Is probably maybe his most famous. For my students, it might be the most infamous because they absolutely hate me talking about the Paradoxical Trinity. But you've probably heard it before, that the nature of war is basically chance, uncertainty, and probability, which is normally associated with the army. Another pole is policy and reason, which is normally associated with the government. And then finally, the violence and passion, the passion of the people, violence and enmity. And these three magnets pull on war, its nature, and sort of explain how war might actually proceed, its nature. And so I wanted to sort of close out my portion by just kind of walking through how we might look at that in the military. So I would say it's a lens. The Trinity, the magnets, it's not something that's predictive. Some of you may have seen the 8-ball that you turn over and you ask, should I invest in Marvel stock today? Not likely. So this is not going to help an Army officer for planning a concrete mission. But at the strategic level, it's helpful because we've got limited objectives and we've got large objectives. Do I totally disarm my opponent, or is it something, am I just trying to intimidate them? Am I just trying to coerce or maybe to deter? And so these objectives help us to determine the strategic plan that we're going to follow. So it's a long way of saying, one, beware of those who quote Clausewitz out of context, okay? Because war could be a duel. He described it so many different ways, and so I want us to keep that in mind as we move forward. And on that note, I'm going to tag out with my partner in crime here.
Yeah, I get the easy job because Jomini's not as complicated, by the way. In fact, he's going to say, no, all that stuff that Clausewitz talked about, you're adding too much emotion and passion and everything to it. War is actually relatively simple. You can see a quote from Summary of the Art of War, which he writes in 1838. It's controlled by invariable scientific principles. Colonel Johnson talked about Clausewitz coming out of the German Romantic movement. In many ways, Jomini comes out of the English Enlightenment, or really, I would argue, more of the scientific revolution idea. The idea that you can somehow understand the world around you through science and mathematics, that the objective is to reduce things down to its basic atomic principles. So if you're thinking about things like war or government, if you take Newton, for example, right, and explain what, and deduce what gravity is. So you have folks like Jomini who are saying, why can't you take those same ideas and apply it to things like war? So his idea is, Clausewitz, you're making this too complex. War is actually really simple. So what he does is he uses kind of a Newtonian idea, and he looks back through time to see what are those key ideas that good, successful commanders have used on the battlefield to win and win decisively. Which is kind of unique. So he comes up with the idea that it's, they all have an objective. The army has to achieve something on the battlefield, i.e. beat the Prussians, right? They seem to always be offensive-minded, by the way, because you can't really win in defense, specifically decisively. You have to be offensive-minded. The third component is mass. So you have some element of mass that you can maneuver around the battlefield. So you can either go straight to the middle, or you can go left, or you can go right, or some combination thereof. So as he comes up with this idea, he starts looking back through history. First, it's Frederick the Great. Then he goes further back, he's borrowing some ideas from an English theorist and practitioner by the name of Henri Lloyd. And he says, in his first book, that he's finally decided and reduced the principles down. He's the first one to come up with these, which in many ways he sort of is, but they've been there all along. He's the first one that writes them. Again, remember, shameless self-promoter, right? He would be real good at late night TV selling stuff. And what he says is that Clausewitz and these guys are making the war too complex. You just have to understand these basic principles. And this is it, right? That these principles prescribe offensive action to mass forces against weaker enemy forces at some decisive point if strategy is to lead to victory. Simple as, you find the decisive point on the battlefield, you mass your forces, and you attack our offense, and then you win decisively. Warfare is not, primordial violence, hatred, passion, policy. It's this. You find the decisive point, you mass on it, and you kill it, and you win. Easy. Right? See, I have the easy part of this presentation. I'm not done yet. I have some more. And what's unique is that we tend to, again, as I said, we kind of use Jomini as forward to Clausewitz. And what I just depicted is kind of the easy way to say, yeah, it really is that simple. To be fair, Jomini is going to acknowledge some of those forces that Colonel Johnson talked about. But he's going to say, they'll have an influence, but the reality is, as long as you know these and practice these, you'll most of the time be okay. So as long as you don't deviate from the principles, as long as you don't misapply the principles, as long as you focus on the decisive point, as long as you are offensive-minded, as long as you know how to match your forces appropriately, things like chance and luck, they may have an influence, but you should be okay most of the time. And again, this is the unique part of Jomini, I think, is that he's not wrong with his principles. Just his understanding, his contextual thought of war is much simpler than Clausewitz. And again, being a staff officer, he's seen war from a much different perspective. So when you're looking at a map and you're looking at the enemy's forces arrayed on the battlefield, your forces arrayed on the battlefield, it probably doesn't look as complicated as a 13-year-old Clausewitz, involved in a cavalry charge. It looks much easier. In fact, his definition of strategy is making war upon a map. And then the application of strategy is the way you array your forces on the battlefield. That's not the way we define strategy today, but he sees things in a very kind of tactically focused perspective. And if you just think about a guy sitting in a big tent somewhere looking at a map and figuring out, okay, where's the best place to attack to get the most decisive effect? That's Jomini's whole concept of what he thinks an army should do. Now, part of this is also tied up in how he defines war, which I think is a bit different, too, than how Clausewitz defines war. Jomini's going to see war in much more practical terms. It really is state-on-state violence. So you have an army fighting another army. Anything beyond that, isn't war. It may look like war, it may kind of taste like war, but it's not quite war, which is unique here. Remember when I said it's shameless up for others? He argues that his theory is always right, which is why you define war very, very deliberately, because if something doesn't fit, it's not the theory's fault, it's just not war, by the way. So the principles may or may not apply, which gives him lots of outs, by the way. So again, the fundamental difference I see here is the fact that he's using, number one, a different philosophical concept. He's not using German romanticism. He's really using scientific revolution ideas to kind of reduce what are the basic building blocks of warfare. And it discounts the idea of humans being part of this. It really is, no, you just need to understand the major principles and you should be okay to do these. Which is going to lead to the next discussion about, the next point about military geniuses and how the commanders view it. Because John is going to be very specific that, although this may sound simple, very few people can do it the right way, which leads us to the genius. Again, you get much more talking time because it's more complex.
Exactly, I need it. Obviously, as Dr. Kalic is channeling his inner Jomini, we can recognize that it's way too simplistic of an understanding of war, right? It can't possibly be that simple. So if you take the worldview that Clausewitz has, what type of leader would you need to wage war in a chaotic, complex, uncertain, fog-filled battlefield? And he would argue that it certainly can't be boiled down to a Betty Crocker recipe where you add 2 parts infantry, 1 part cavalry with a pinch of artillery fire. It's more complex, and it's more complex because of the human domain. The human element makes it more complex. So if that's what war looks like, then we've got to find out what is a military genius. What type of leader could possibly thrive and prevail in a battle like that that's characterized by this type of battlefield. And I've got a quotation here, it talks about, and this is sort of his view, if we then ask what sort of mind is likeliest to display the qualities of military genius, experience and observation will both tell us that it is the inquiring rather than the creative mind, the comprehensive rather than the specialized, the calm rather than the excitable head to which in war we would choose to entrust the fate of our brothers and children and the safety and honor of our country. So Clausewitz is going to turn to the same studies as Jomini. He's going to look at Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great arguably makes Prussia, and he's known for his aggressive tactics, his highly disciplined, highly trained armies, and the fact that he's able to build Prussia, and it becomes the paradigm army of its day. And then, of course, we've talked about the fact that Clausewitz is at the front of the classroom at the school of Napoleon. And it's the school of hard knocks to a great extent. And a lot of his experiences early on in his career at the hands of Napoleon are negative. And so it gives him a very realistic, practical viewpoint as far as what is possible for understanding or not understanding, and maybe what is not to be understood in war. And some of the things that he talks about as far as military genius, it's this idea of courage that is required. And this courage is both a physical courage and it's also a moral courage. Physical because war is a dangerous place. Moral because, again, it goes back to if war is as chaotic as it seems, then you can imagine the type of staying power mentally that you would have to engage and fight and prevail on that sort of a battlefield. Because as the mists of war and the fog is swirling, you're literally trying to make a decision of life and death with committing your reserves or trying to take advantage of that one fleeting opportunity. And as a result, you have to have that kind of countenance, that kind of courage and staying power as a leader. He also talks about the disposition. You cannot be going off half-cocked. I mean, that's the comprehensive side, the educated side. He suggests that a leader has to come from, a military genius, from a civilized community. And he actually gets taken to task by subsequent scholars for that, but that's part of his worldview as far as who could be a military genius. And so in order to prevail, let me see, I've got a couple other, if I can get this to work. Hang on 1 second. My notes are over here on the side. No, it's on the computer here, but I can't find the mouse. All right, let me just pull up here. And that, by the way, would be an example of friction. It was actually all staged just so you'd understand that things never go as totally planned. We talked about courage, but he also talks about this idea of energy of purpose. And energy of purpose is an interesting one. And I am not a Napoleonic scholar, but one of the things that I've been amazed at with Napoleon is all the different things that he was into as a leader. We know about his military prowess. I'm from down in Mississippi. Nabe spent quality time at Fort Polk, Louisiana, home of the Napoleonic Code. So he was part of that process. He was redefining how their system for weights and measurements for time, their penal system. And so there's an incredible energy of purpose that goes along with these geniuses. Frederick the Great is known for his involvement in training his soldiers directly, even as the head of state. And so that energy of purpose is absolutely critical. And last, there's this idea of coup d'oeil, and the ability to see with the mind's eye, that split second. Maybe some of you have read a book by Malcolm Gladwell called Blink, to where a leader intuitively knows, or a fireman on an incident commander immediately knows that a fire's about to get out of hand. And likewise, the commander needs to know when momentum has shifted and it's time to commit the reserves, or to start the cavalry charge, or to reposition. And so this ability to see things more quickly, to adapt to a very dynamic battlefield, is an absolutely critical component of what Clausewitz believes is military genius. And so that's kind of how he lays it out. And I will tag out with Dr. Kalic and see how Jomini defines military genius.
Actually, not much different, believe it or not. This is one of those unique elements that they both have some commonality, specifically in military genius. Like Clausewitz, Jomini is going to also reference essentially Napoleon and Frederick the Great. One of the big differences, though, is that Clausewitz is going to talk about how experience can help temper a commander as well and help inform that military genius. Jomini is going to take a little bit of a different tack in the beginning and say that folks like Frederick or Napoleon are inherently born with this innate ability to be able to apply the principles of war. And he's going to use the same concept of coup d'oeil, right? It looks like coup d'oil, but it's coup d'oeil, right? And this idea of coup d'oeil is that the commander has this inner sense of how to array the forces appropriately, when to attack, when to shift, when to attack left versus when to attack right, when to attack up the middle. So I would argue that their ideas of what the commander is and this sense of genius is not the way we kind of think of genius today, like Mensa genius, Stephen Hawking type of stuff. It really is, you have an inner feeling that you can trust, you're born with innate abilities, and you inherently know how to read a battlefield. And Jomini, and I think largely based upon his experience as a staff officer, that he puts a lot of trust in being able to read a map, to understand how terrain feeds into analyzing where the enemy may attack and how to array your forces to either blunt that attack or to go on the offensive. So this coup d'oeil thing is probably the most significant part in Jomini, because he says, if you're born with these great abilities, think of Michael Jordan, right? Fantastic athletic ability, or LeBron James being from Ohio, by the way, who's on par. That they're just born with something inherently different. Now, how that's developed and refined is significant, but Jomini's going to make the argument that warfare is going to be that tempering force. Then if you apply an inner eye to this innate natural ability, you'll end up with a Jomini or a Frederick the Great. And he makes a point that not everyone's born with it, and it doesn't mean that if you're not born with it, your nation's doomed to lose every war. He says you can start to kind of study and understand the principles of war, but you'll never have that special greatness like these characters do. So I think that's where he differs mainly from Clausewitz in this idea that you can, if you apply the principles, it will get you this far. But if you're born with innate abilities, it'll get you this far because you'll just have something different and better than everybody else. You have a natural ability to read the battlefield, to understand, to have this inner intuition. In fact, I think the best way to understand this Cadoi concept is really the inner eye, that you're able to look out and kind of read the scenario and say, okay, I'm 2 or 3 steps ahead of you, so I'm going to do A, B, and C, which makes you look like you're very good. If you think of Napoleon at like Jena, he has this kind of unnatural ability to kind of use the literal fog of the battlefield to orchestrate a phenomenal attack, which is significant. So I think, number one, the big difference is Jomini's going to argue they're born with something unique. Number two, they have this Cadoi that they refine throughout their careers and their lives, and that helps them to apply the principles faster, quicker, better than everybody else. See, again, Jomini's really short and quick. Clausewitz is complex. Yeah, this leads us into uncertainty, right? Jomini's not a big fan of Clausewitz, by the way. In fact, he spends lots of time kind of rebutting him, and this is one of his more significant digs in 1838, which Clausewitz is already dead, by the way, so it's really easy to attack the guy. But he says, you know, you can be a great man and have these innate abilities, but if you believe in these kind of pedantic systems, i.e. Clausewitz, by the way, that war's complex and dynamic and all these crazy forces, you're going to have to forget what you learned, which, again, learning those basic atomic elements of what is warfare, objective offense, mass maneuver. That don't be fooled by the smoke and mirrors of violence and passion and hatred. It really is simple. Objective offense, mass maneuver.
So perhaps he who writes last writes best, I suppose, and maybe Clausewitz suffers from his early demise. Our last point to sort of bring through for comparisons here is this idea of uncertainty in war, because both theorists recognize the uncertainty, and they've got different approaches. And so from the standpoint of Clausewitz, that whole complicated way that he comes to it, it paints a very grim picture of a swirling, chaotic battlefield that is dangerous, it's fickle, and it's subject to change on a dime. So you have to have that inner eye ability of the military genius. And there are a few areas that I wanted to highlight to talk about the uncertainty of war. And one of the things that we teach our students at the Command and General Staff College is this idea of the 4 Fs. And you're familiar with some of them. The friction of war. We got to see the friction of my briefing just a minute ago. And the next one is the idea of fear. War is a dangerous place. And likewise, it's a fatiguing, it's an unforgiving place. So this exertion can lead to uncertainty. And of course, fickle fate. Chance is alive and well on the battlefield. And so, going back, how do you mitigate that? Well, you have the military genius that both theorists talk about. So I just wanted to kind of walk through those. And I thought this captured this idea of friction there. And you've probably heard some variation of it, and I'll just read it for you a little bit. But everything in war is very simple. But the simplest thing is difficult. And countless minor incidents, the kind you can never really foresee, combine to lower the general level of performance so that one always falls far short of the intended goal. Sounds simple, and it really is simple until it's not. Until the fog of war, until the clash of steel, until bullets are whizzing over your head, and people are dying to your left and right. All of a sudden, friction creeps into the equation. And so I had a brilliant commander once told me, Johnson, it always takes longer than it takes. Now, when I first heard that, I was like, that was the simplest, stupidest thing I'd ever heard until my convoy didn't leave on time. And we didn't leave on time because we couldn't find my driver. So my driver disappears. I'm the convoy commander, and it's like, wow, friction. Okay, my commander didn't call it that. He called it something else. But alive and well out there. And so why is this? The human element. People. The complexity creeps in because battalions are hundreds of individuals, and they are all voting. The enemy is voting. Weather is shaping things, terrain. And so collectively, these things lead to friction. And I wanted to just to try to make this more of a well-rounded approach, I've got a copy of a famous order here for you. And so this is, I'll read it, this is a good old British scroll here. But Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Troop horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left. R. Airy, who's the aide, immediate. Well, that's pretty straightforward, right? Just execute that. What does this wind up leading us to? Okay, it's in the Crimean War, the charge of the Light Brigade. So it's simple, unless you're the Light Brigade, and the commander wants you to prevent these cannons from being taken away and captured, but you understand it's these cannons. And so as a result, half a league, half a league, half a league onward, into the Valley of Death rides the 600 off of a miscommunication. And you can imagine it's scratched out very quickly, and you know, it looks something like this. You've all seen Errol Flynn in the Charge of the Light Brigade. It wasn't quite as handy and tidy as all that, although some of the Light Brigade do make it to the guns. They are quickly rebuffed and return. Just a great photo or painting. And then just so we could go there, Tennyson has immortalized it. Friction. Friction alive and well off of what looks like a simple order. Go take those guns unless it's not simple. A second piece that goes in this is the idea of complexity. And I threw this up there because we've been watching on television and seeing the type of operations that our troops conduct all the time. And it's complex and it's ambiguous. Sometimes we don't know who the enemy is, who our friends are. So it probably sounds like other wars. Probably sounds like Vietnam, perhaps. And that complexity and ambiguity, according to Clausewitz, is always there. It's ever present on the battlefield. And it's given that nature, war's nature, it leads to this complexity. You may have seen this one. I couldn't resist putting this in there. And you guys, this was in the news. It's been several years now. But this was the understanding of what we needed to do in Afghanistan to solve the problem, right? So it's like, all right, slap each other 5. We've got a solution here, and it's just that easy, unfortunately, until it's not. So this is the worldview that Clausewitz brings in, and that we have to accept that there is fog and friction. Fear is out there. Commanders are going to make poor judgments because they're tired. The troops are exerted, and things like the fog that creeps in and surrounds war, you can't discount it. So on this note, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kalic. We'll see how Jomini approaches this idea.
It's not as complex as this.
That's what I thought.
And there's no poetry, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Here's his comment on friction. And you can see a significant difference with just this quotation, right? It's all about really action. So you have an inaccurate transmission of orders. Someone's not, you know, your defective inner eye isn't working that day. Maybe a little crud in it or something. I don't know. But they're all kind of essential character flaws. This idea of uncertainty in war, Jomini oftentimes is depicted as though he doesn't pay any attention to that stuff, which isn't true. He does acknowledge that there are complexity, there's fog, there's friction, there's all these other forces in war and battle. But his major differences, and this is where I think Jomini becomes significant, is that the uncertainty on the battlefield is where he kind of pulls everything together. And he's going to put it really on the center of the commander. That commander is the one who you want to deal with uncertainty on the battlefield. Remember, they're born with specific abilities, special abilities, a strong inner eye. And they alone can kind of overcome these ideas. They can overcome complexity on the battlefield because they understand something differently than everybody else. So he recognizes it, but again, Jomini always goes back to his touchstones. It's the principles of war and the commander, the genius commander. And it's the balance between that. And if you think about, it really is the balance between art and science, right? How many folks in here have ever tried to be an artist? And there are kind of rules on how you mix colors and all that fun stuff, right? Really definitive rules. But then you do your paint by number and it doesn't quite look like a beautiful painting. Why not? Or maybe an easier analogy, a cookbook, right? You get Julia Child's cookbook on how to, roast a duck the French way. And you get everything out, you follow every step of what happens when you go to eat the duck that's black and crispy. There's an artistic side of this, which Jomini oftentimes gets, I get dinged on, I guess. We tend to focus on it's just as simple as objective offense, pass, maneuver. But the reality is, he says, this commander with his abilities, with this kudoy, has the ability to kind of take those scientific principles and then artistically apply them at the right time that they are necessary. So you can take that recipe from Julia Child and make it a fantastic meal. Or you can, follow the tenets of how to paint and then make it look phenomenal. It really is in that artistic application, which is why his book's called The Art of War, by the way, not The Science of War. He puts a lot of stock in that genius and the ability to blend art and science, to understand when to know to be straight up offensive-minded or when to go to defense and then transition to an offense. He's not as simple as it's just offense all the time, which I think sometimes we tend to portray it as. He really is about that commander reading the battlefield and dealing with uncertainties. And he makes comments that you're not always going to win. It's going to be messy sometimes. But for the most part, if you follow the principles and you have the right commander with the great inner eye, things should turn out pretty well. I'll let you close since I opened it, right?
Well, let's see where we take this. We've been with Julia Childs, Betty Crocker. We've had poetry and art, so I'm not sure what we do with that, but it's got to be a finale of some part. So one of the things that I want to tie it back to the students that we have at the Command and General Staff College, because as you look and you watch the news, you read the papers, warfare is complex, and it runs a spectrum from what we would call very limited operations and even humanitarian assistance and peacekeeping, all the way up to what you would know as full-fledged warfare and combat. And this is actually taken out from the U.S. Army Pacific, and this is their envision of what we call multi-battle domain. Now that's highfalutin Army speak for the fact that it's not just on land or the air or in space or in the sea time. It's also computers, cyber warfare, and other emerging domains. And it's brought about by things that you're very familiar with. This social media and the information age has made it a very complex battlefield. So if warfare looks like this, which is pretty complex in my estimate, and we have to convert that last scene into something, and this is from Operation Desert Storm, you may have seen it before, and these arrows represent what various units are going to actually do. So we have to go from some sort of a concept, and we have to break it down into action. In this case, these are divisions, and many of you are familiar with the story of ejecting Iraq from Kuwait. Because out there are Marines that are going to have to assault a mountain or an objective. We've got units that are going to have, a squad is going to have to take direct action, in this case, to do a cordon and search. We might have to call in an airstrike, which is a very concrete thing in that complex battlefield. Or it may look something like this, which is a humanitarian assistance mission in the Philippines. But my point for you is that war is complex, war is chaotic, and to that side of it, Clausewitz is really handy to help us visualize that, to understand and visualize the battlefield and what's required. But at some point in time, young American soldiers and Marines and airmen and Coast Guard, they've got to go do things. And in that world, you have to be very specific. And so Dr. Kalic and I would like to leave you with this idea that maybe combining these views and sort of taking the strengths and understanding the weaknesses of each theorist, but help us to maybe find that common ground so that I can look at that complex, chaotic battlefield and maybe understand it and try to find out what the problem really is. But at some point, we've got to define the problem and figure out what the solution is. And when you go into that deliberate planning, it sure is handy to have Jomini in your hip pocket and his principles of war, his lines of operation. So he helps us to translate that chaos and complexity into action so that an airstrike takes place or a humanitarian mission takes place, or an assault on an objective takes place. So this is sort of the view that we try to bring to our students, is to get them to look through different analytical frameworks or different lenses to look at war. And if we were really crazy, we would have brought maybe a third and a fourth instructor here, and we could have talked about Sun Tzu, or we could have talked about John Boyd, or Amelia Duhay, or any of a number of theorists, because the more views that you get, maybe the better your understanding is. I like to think of the quotation that the map is not the territory. And maybe you've heard that before. So Clausewitz, his ideas aren't war, but they're a way we can think about it. Jomini, for all of the hot air that Dr. Kalic has thrown out there today.
Whoa.
Hey. So, you know, his map is not the territory, but the more maps that we get to understand, we have a better, more clarity on what the battlefield or what the territory actually looks like. So on that note, I think that concludes our portion, and we would love to entertain any questions that you might have.
I guess now we can both stand up here.
Yeah, I think so. If it's really hard, I'll let you answer.
Yeah.
If it's something I don't, I'll be like, Kaylee? Yes, sir.
The American Civil War would seem to have been a contemporary application of a lot of these principles. How much of an influence were these guys on the actual participants in that conflict?
I'll let you answer because it's in your lane, I think.
Right. Clausewitz isn't well known until after 1870. Jomini is getting pitched through Dennis Hart Mahatma at West Point prior to the Civil War, and there's lots of discussion that the vast majority of Civil War generals actually understand his principles really well. So there's significant influence. Now, what's unique about that is there is a theory that if two armies apply Jomini's principles, guess what you end up with? A bloody stalemate, Civil War-like, or World War I, by the way. So, and again, Jomini talks about, he doesn't talk about the enemy much in his book, by the way, because the assumption is if they're immutable principles, everyone's doing it, you just have to do it faster, better than your enemy. So Jomini is alive and well in U.S. Civil War battles. It's really easy to kind of analyze battles using those principles.
And Clausewitz is really not going to become well known until Helmut von Moltke in the Prussian Empire, as they come up in specific like the 1870s with Franco-Prussian War, and all of a sudden von Moltke is going to reintroduce Clausewitz to the Prussian and then onward into the German army, and that's basically how Clausewitz gets introduced to the world.
These two thinkers seem to be before the time we have now, like in Vietnam and the Middle East, where the populace is more involved, and the military doesn't operate against only the opposition military, but it has to take into account the populace and the culture and that whole mess you showed up there. Does this change the approach that and the philosophy that the military would have toward the conduct of wars now and in the future? Oh, and add into that the extraordinary change in technology.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll pounce on that one.
Yeah, and I'll add it.
So first off, it's a great question, and yeah, it totally compounds the problem because the passion of the people, the will of the people, the political will of the state, so it's all at play. But as you've sort of mentioned already, now we've got CNN, now we've got social media, so even down to a blogger is already influencing that popular will. And so as folks go out and they're getting their news from wherever they get their news or whatever blog they go to, whatever television or website, so it compounds that will of the people. And you may recall one of the case studies that we look at is the Vietnam War, and we talk about in our classes about how Walter Cronkite and his, the idea that the Vietnam War comes into the living room. And so it brings the American people, or it brings Vietnam to Main Street, USA. And so it's only gotten more challenging as that goes. So what we try to use Clausewitz for is that understanding that we do have to always consider the population, the people, both our own and the will to prosecute a war, but also your opponent, and how the conflict is going to affect them. What is their political will? What is the will of their people? And so it becomes a very helpful framework for considering that.
Jomini, different, again. That's too complex. What's unique is at the end of his life, Jomini's, I think, starting to see some of those elements. Crimea is one of them. We're starting to see some public action and some public discussion. And there's some indication that he may start tempering his views, but really you start to see the influence of, I think, media and the public back home really coming out in, the Boer War, the Russo-Japanese War, the First World War. So it really is kind of after his time, but I think he's seen the beginning of it and he may recognize it. But I think, ultimately, if I had to kind of be a betting man, I think he's just too tied to his principles. He's going to say, no. And in many ways, I guess his theory is more of a theory of battle, and his idea that if you get this quick, decisive, big, overwhelming win, you're going to automatically get a strategic victory, which is good, but the days of those, I think, are long gone. So I'm not sure how he would respond to that. Now, on the technology piece, he's pretty clear. He says his principles, regardless of time and technology, are true, which is, a pretty bold statement, especially in 1838.
Both of these theorists make room for military geniuses. What are a couple of examples? What are their traits? And what are some of the limits of military genius?
Well, I guess there are plenty out there besides Dr. Kalic and me.
That's
so,
right.
But I haven't met many of them, actually.
No.
So I guess I'll start off on it. I mean, both theorists would say they are few and far between. And so you may have one Napoleon in a series of lifetimes, or a Frederick the Great. So that is a problem. That's a problem for every army if you subscribe to that view. So, for example, many armies develop a staff system to try to get a collective genius by all the different specialties. So you might have heard of the German General Staff. In our own army, we have the School of Advanced Military Studies, which is trying to get young majors, give them an extra year of education to just make them as broad as possible, so that collectively you might be able to create that type of a genius on a staff to support a commander. But I would say that statistically they are very, very few and far between.
I would concur. As far as the downside of it, if you don't get it, what happens? Are you doomed to lose? I don't know. Yeah, I think Jomini would agree there. Maybe once in a generation. Again, so then what do you do when you have a kind of, I suppose, a whole generation of kind of mediocre military commanders? And he doesn't answer that.
I would ask about Dr. Harry Summers, or Colonel Harry Summers' book on strategy in the post-Vietnam era. And I read a long time ago, my recollection is that he really fixed the centers of gravity and friction mainly in the streets of America, far removed from the battlefield. And so I don't think Clausewitz and Jomini envisioned into the future that kind of warfare. So I guess I ask you to reverse engineer. What do you think they would say about Harry Summers' analysis of the Vietnam experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. The good news is if we have to phone a friend here, I'm feeling pretty good about phoning a friend over there. But one of the things that Colonel Harry Summers does is he uses the Trinity, the idea, and he boils it down to the people, army, and the government, and uses that lens on both to look at the United States and to look at North Vietnam. And so his simplification using that lens kind of puts Clausewitz back on the map. And to some scholars actually confounds the issue through that simplification, and his argument really leads to this idea of if the military had only been left alone to prosecute the war, that the United States would have prevailed. Since then, that has come into a lot of discussion about that, whether the veracity of that. So,
I agree with Colonel Johnson that I'm not sure Jomini would like that book, by the way, because it plays with this interaction of this trinity. And he would say, no, it's simple. Focus on your objective. You need to beat the North Vietnamese and just use offense, mass, and maneuver. But your point is sound in the fact that what if the government says, no, you can't use mass, by the way? And I don't know how he would respond, because again, maybe he would say, well, that's just not real war, by the way. Because that's always kind of his unique out. So as Napoleon has to deal with, the bleeding ulcer in Spain, he's going to say, well, that's not really war, by the way. So my theory may not apply. So that's always an easy out for these theorists, is, well, that just doesn't fit my definition of what war is, so therefore it may not work as perfect as I think it should work. And I think Vietnam would fit into that definition.
And the other thing is that Clausewitz would say that the enemy gets a vote. The enemy is an animate opponent, so it is responding. It's competition in a Darwinistic sense. So you have to expect that the enemy is trying to win as well, and so you have to understand the enemy. And so that's probably another point of failure. And Summers does talk about that to an extent, but recognizing that your opponent is also an animate entity. So
I think that's another difference, is that Jomini's going to say, no, it's just try to do the same thing you're doing. So if you think of John Boyd's OODA loop, right, observe, orient, decide, act, the idea is if you can do that faster and quicker than your enemy, you should win. That's kind of the classic Jomini approach. So his assumption isn't this living, breathing dynamic. The enemy's acting just like you and applying the same principles. You just have to do it better than them, and you should win.
I know Clausewitz enters into the concept of total warfare, but I don't know the approach of Jomini on that.
He doesn't talk about total or limited war. It's just war. And again, the definition of war for him is you have two armies that represent nation states that line up against the field and clash with one another. And again, he talks about Spain and People's War, but the idea that it's not quite the same, that that's something a bit different and not the same, and the principles, again, may or may not apply because it's not that Jominian clash. It's a really kind of narrow focus, which again, if you're a theorist, it leaves you lots of outs in case somebody finds problems with your theory.
And Clausewitz doesn't actually use the term total war either. He has his absolute war, which is that theoretical idea, but he really deals with what he terms real war. And then it's somewhere, real war is somewhere between that and absolute war. Although I think neither one of them could have possibly foreseen the advent of nuclear weapons and how close that might take us to absolute war. But it is interesting. I would encourage you to pay attention when you're looking at the news and listening to different ways these terms, total war, for example, is thrown out there, because it's used in a lot of different ways. So there are many working definitions that kind of make the issue, confound the issue.
We introduced the work of Henri Summers. I'd ask you to consider, from the perspective of these theorists, how the work of General H.R. McMaster in looking at Vietnam, in which he argues that Joint Chiefs advised the president, you're going to need 500,000 troops, you're going to need to mine Haiphong Harbor, and you're going to need to mine the North. And President Johnson and the Secretary of Defense arguably, I think as Dr. Kalic was suggesting, denied the military the ability to use those options.
I think Jomini would say that's where you screwed up. That's why we didn't win. We didn't apply the principles. And again, one of the problems with Jomini is bringing him forward. Alfred Thayer Mahan is going to take his principles and apply them to sea power. Duhay, as Colonel Johnson mentioned, is going to take those theories and apply them to air power. But when you start adding in these other forces with limited war, and the government wants to maintain it at this level because it's limited, I'm not sure how Jomini would ever deal with that, because he just sees it as this straight clash of armies. So it really is more of a theory of battle with the idea that if you win and win big, you're going to win it all. And I think time evolves, and that concept is really an outdated idea.
And from my perspective with Clausewitz, the political aspect drives exactly what you're talking about. That nexus between politics and war to bring about that political objective, and since there's no separating it, it would have to be considered. I do, since you brought up General McMaster, for the last 3 years, he's come and talked to our class. And one of the things that he tells them, he talks about, I guess when you're a three-star general, you can say this. He talks about McMaster's continuities of how you think about history, and you'll know why I'm smiling in a second, because when I talk about him. So one, he says that war is political, okay? Two, he says it's a battle of wills. And then he says war is uncertain, and that war is political, if I didn't already mention that one. So that, his message for our students, though, is it's not how you think about, it's not what to think about war, it's how we think about war. So you have to remember that it's always political. You have to remember it's always uncertain. You may go to war, you may bomb an airfield in Syria, but you have an animate opponent. You don't know how it's going to work out. It's a clash of wills. So I think, to me, for both of these theorists, it's a way to think, not what to think. Because you have to, as part of that competition, we've got to be fully engaged in trying to figure out what the actual problem is we're trying to solve. But those 4 principles from McMaster are about how we can think about history and warfare.
You've brought to us 2 very different thinkers with 2 very different approaches to war, each with his own set of insights, and each convinced that those insights are important. The question is, for military officers and leaders today, which of these thinkers is more useful and important for those officers to study?
I think we agree on this, but
Yeah.
you want to start, and then
I will.
talk
To
away.
be honest, and Dr. Huber should probably answer that question
That's
himself. So I think there's a penalty flag for retired instructors from Command and General Staff College.
Not only that, but he also authored the lessons on Clausewitz and Jomini.
It's a good point,
too, so.
which sadly I took over his
That's right.
lessons, and they haven't been the same ever since, Dr. Huber. But I think it goes back to our final answer that, really both of them have application. It's not a hierarchy. And sometimes when our students first come in, they hear we're going to teach them Clausewitz, and so we get the lizard look where their eyes roll back in their head, and they're like, oh, God. And then they try to read it in like 30 minutes right before class, which is guaranteed to blow circuits and cause all sorts of fritzing of electronics. So once they're over that stress and that shock, they start to realize that maybe they haven't been looking at Clausewitz and studying it. So we sort of teach them that maybe Clausewitz helps you to think about and define what the problem is. But as I mentioned, there's got to be that transition into action. And when it comes to transitioning and writing those orders so that you don't get a charge of the Light Brigade, so that you get a humanitarian mission that executes, in keeping with the commander's strategy, I think you have to have ideas like Jomini. And Jomini is actually, if you picked it up, you could look at our ADPs, which is one of our doctrine manuals, and you could actually recognize Jomini directly in there. So I think they're very much more of a complementary. So I'm not going to answer your trick question by rank ordering them, sir.
I would agree. In fact, I used, in teaching the Jomini lesson, one of my parlor tricks is to kind of play doctrine roulette. So you ask the students if, is Jomini still relevant, and inevitably they'll say no. So I'd walk to the back room and get a doctrinal manual and read a random page, and inevitably you can link it to Jomini somehow. And again, I'm with Colonel Johnson on this, that unfair question by a guy who taught me most of what I know right now, by the way. I think the way I pitch it is a little different. That I kind of use a Hegelian dialectic, right? So you have thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That you can't get a synthesis in war because you just don't know in advance. So if you have Clausewitz and Jomini, you have a much deeper, richer, fuller understanding of the element of war, which is why I like that last slide with the overlap. That, that becomes a synthesis. So depending on what you are, where you are, what's going on, what the read is of the situation, you can apply some Clausewitz or Jomini. There's no proper prescription. The doctrine police aren't going to come up and say, hey, you misapplied doctrine. Oh, and you misapplied theory too, by the way. You're there to solve a problem. So by having both of them, And using them in whatever way you see fit, I think is probably the best answer. And again, if you want to add in some Sun Tzu or Mao or whomever, I think it's just a good idea to give them a deeper, broader understanding of tools to understand what war is.
Since you mentioned politics, I just wanted one thing that we do. So this is on war, and I've tabbed it so you believe that I might have read some of it. And but I ask my guys to tell me when to stop, and I start thumbing through it, and they'll say stop. And as we go through, and I'll go to the first title, and the topic is operations on a flank. Oh, that sounds pretty specific, actually.
Familiar.
I'll go to the next chapter. Let's see, the next book, and he talks about returning to the interior of the country. Okay, inundations, where if it's wet terrain, crossing a trail, crossing a river. So even though we spent all of my time talking about his ideas on complexity and chaos, swirling fog of war, he was still out there writing about some of the very same ideas, even more specifically than Jomini in some instances. And that's also part of what has been sort of for us put in the dustbin of history, because it doesn't relate as much. So we find out of Clausewitz on war that his ideas about the physical and the moral aspects of war are what we've pulled forward, and we've forgotten about what he says about crossing a stream or how to camp at night, that sort of thing.
Two quick questions. One, the three magnets up there seem to be missing one, and that would be intelligence. I would think that intelligence is very, very key to the successful prosecution of a war. And were the Teutonic Knights a German soccer team?
Yeah, I think I had one of their scarves at the house from when I was stationed over there. But your point about intelligence is very interesting, and it's another contrasting point. So Clausewitz was not a fan because of the uncertainty and the ambiguity that went along with it, the human element of it. I think you're absolutely right. We teach our officers that intelligence and knowing your enemy drives maneuver. But in reality, Clausewitz is fairly negative on the role of intelligence. It's a cautionary tale to him because of the uncertainty.
As you would expect, Jomini's the counter. He's a big fan of intelligence. And again, if you're thinking about battle, intelligence is key, especially if you want to, how you're going to apply the offense, the mass, the maneuver, specifically the maneuver. So he's a big fan of making sure you have good intelligence. But again, he's always focused on that commander. So it's not just the actual intelligence coming to you, it's how the commander is going to interpret and disseminate that intelligence as well. So he does trust it, but he trusts it with the commander interpreting it and disseminating it. I think we wore him out.
Well, I tell you what, I was getting nervous. When we started talking about the Teutonic Knights again, I was getting ready to exit stage left.
That's all you. Well, thanks for being the guinea pigs. I appreciate it.
Larry Brown.